Guys, this is Mr. Schultz, Eastman History here. So I am just going to be covering the last little bit of this section. So you guys spend some time learning about the Reformation, which was that time period where you saw the church being challenged by figures like Martin Luther, John Calvin, Zwingli, Henry VIII. And here's the thing, the church was the most powerful institution in Europe. You know what? They're that powerful. They're not going to take a lot of this sitting down. So they're going to have a counter Reformation, a response to try to stop the Reformation. So before we get started, here's what you want to make sure you have with you right now. All right. You want to make sure you have the overview of the confirmation note taking sheet. There's a thing called the Council of Trent readings, and there's also a link to a video on the Inquisition. All of this should be on Canvas or Google Classroom for you. So easy enough. And then your assignment will be to do the note taking. And then after each section, there's a question where you have to write like a summary. So again, we're going to be grading you for your note taking, but also how well and effectively you answer the questions based on the material that is being provided to you. So with that being said, let's just remind ourselves a little bit about the Reformation. All right, so I've got a picture here of Martin Luther. It should look familiar. But what I really want to do is go over some of the issues, complaints, problems people had with the church that led to the Reformation. Now, the textbook reading you did had like them broken into four categories, and there was two per category. I'm going to try to simplify that for you a little bit here, just to make it a little bit faster. So the number one problem that kind of spurred all of this were indulgences. And again, just remember what indulgences are. Indulgences were those uh, pardons you could buy and get yourself into heaven. What it did was you would buy this kind of like reduced time in purgatory. And that, again, was this kind of middle ground between heaven and hell. You didn't go straight to hell, but you weren't good enough to get to heaven. You went to purgatory to work off your sins. The indulgence would cut down on your time. All right, the next thing, there was this view the church was corrupt and selfish. All right, remember one of the big things that they did was they would not only were they charged for indulgences, which is really only a rich people thing to do. That's how you can have you buy your way in. That made a lot of people very upset. But the other thing was they felt the church was very selfish in the fact that they one raised money to basically build these huge, ridiculous, often let's be honest, ridiculous churches made of gold and marble and silver and all these things that like the average person couldn't afford. And on top of that, they also charge people taxes. When you go to church today, you give money if you want, right? Maybe your church requires a certain percentage, but the reality is you are not legally required to do that. All right, next thing, the Pope. They felt the Pope was illegitimate. This was talked about before, but let's just make sure we understand. The Pope is claiming that he is the direct spokesperson for God, that he cannot make mistakes. The problem was the Pope is a man. And very often the Pope was a political figure and not religious, often using their power to get the things they wanted or scare people. So the reality is this, the Pope didn't seem all that religious to people. He seemed more of a powerful, corrupt figure who was more interested in keeping their power than actually serving the people. And then lastly, the Protestants, Martin Luther, Zwingli, Calvin, not really Henry, but Henry, I guess, all felt the church was teaching the wrong stuff. If you remember from the reading guide, they talked about this idea that like, how do you get to heaven? The church said you have to go to heaven to get to heaven. You have to do these specific rituals, the sacraments. You have to do these things. If you don't do them and believe in God, you go to hell. All right. These guys are different. The Protestants are arguing, okay, first of all, and they didn't agree on all of it, but they said, by and large, get baptized. All right, that be a good person, believe in God, and that's it. And so they felt what the church was saying by making up stuff that wasn't in the Bible, that was false teachings. So these are the big problems that the Protestants have. The Counter-Reformation is supposed to look at these problems and solve them. Well, let's see how well they do. All right, so the church has three things they're going to do in response, a three-prong attack, I call it. So the first one is they're going to do inquisitions in trials. Essentially, their goal is to find enemies of the church and eliminate them. And now here's the thing, we'll get into this a little bit later, but what makes you an enemy of the church can be any number of things. It could be as simple as not agreeing with everything the church is saying. You could actively try to go against the church. There's this huge range of things, but their goal was to go find their enemies and get rid of them. Next thing, Jesuits and missionaries. We'll talk about that more in a second, but basically they wanted to educate people and convert them to Catholicism, aka the Catholic Church. Because again, you should have read about this. There are many denominations. Being Catholic is a version of Christianity. Protestantism is a whole huge branch of Christianity with all these different subgroups, right? All right. So again, they want to convert people to back to Catholicism through education. And then lastly, they're going to decide to make some reforms and changes to try to solve some of these problems. They're going to have a bunch of meetings called the Council of Trent. They're going to get together and going to try to solve some, notice I say some of these problems. So the first thing we want to talk about is the missionaries and the Jesuits. This is the simplest one. So Jesuits were created by a gentleman named Ignatius of Loyola. He was a Spanish gentleman. He was born to a noble family. He had served in the military. And if you look up at this picture right here, you'll notice he is a priest. He eventually becomes a priest. But here he is rocking armor and a weapon. That's not what you expect for a priest to be doing. You think of them as being holy and supposed to be pushing nonviolence. Now, he wasn't advocating violence, but he takes that military discipline of control and structure and order and then uses to create this thing called the Jesuits. And basically, they're a part of the Catholic Church, right? They're priests, but they're kind of like special commando priests is the best way I can put it. All right, because here's the tagline we want to remember. They're going to focus on education. All right, they're going to basically try to get people to come back to the Catholic Church or join the Catholic Church by giving them education. So how does one do that? So first thing they were going to do is open up schools and universities. If you haven't noticed, I put all these graphics right here. These might look familiar. There's Georgetown University, Boston College, GU here in this case stands for Gonzaga. These are all Jesuit universities here in the United States. There are a total of 26 of them here. And so Jesuit colleges exist. And basically, here's what a Jesuit does, right? So normal priests will go and learn how to be priests, right? They'll learn how to basically take care of a church. Jesuits will go to college and they'll earn a PhD or a doctorate, which is essentially the highest type of degree you can earn. And then they usually teach others about it. So I personally, Mr. Schultz, I went to a Jesuit university, and so these guys teach you about everything. And so the idea is that they look at the full scope of knowledge and think that is a sign of kind of like the wonder of God in the church and brings people in. So besides opening schools and universities, and there's also high schools all over the country too, they decided when exploration starts, when the boats arrived in the New World, right, or in Asia or in Africa, usually the first people off that boat were military, right? But that second person was probably the Jesuit, a priest, and they were there to convert people. So if you want to know why Catholic Church is so popular, it is 1.2 billion people in the world today, it's because of these guys. Particularly if you look at places like Central America, South America, all right, if any of you have, or if any of you have that as your background, chances are you were Catholic, or at least your family has follows the Catholic tradition. It's because the Spanish brought it with them, forced everybody to join, and that led to the explosion of the Catholic Church in that part of the world. So why don't you pause, answer your summary question about did the Jesuits really solve any of the problems presented by the Protestants? Cool. Pause me. Get back to you in a second. All right, next one, Inquisition and persecution. So here's what you're gonna do. Watch a brief video, answer the questions, take notes. It's not that long. I think it's about 8 minutes. Go ahead and do that. When you're done, we're gonna come back together and we're gonna do some just key terms that you should know about the Inquisition. So go ahead, pause me, find the link on Canvas or Google Classroom and watch the video. All right, so some key terms I want you to know. So the first one, Spanish Reconquista. So I don't know if you speak Spanish, but I think you can figure out Reconquista might mean to reconquer. Anyway, so what basically winds up happening is Spain was taken over by Muslims. If you remember, we talked about that and the spread of Islam and how fast and quickly it spread. They were controlling Spain, which is part of the reason that the Europeans decided to go and invade the Middle East, because to them, the Muslims were knocking on their door. Well, after hundreds of years of fighting, the Spanish finally reclaim Spain and drive all the Muslims out. Well, not all, as the video talked about, but a lot of them. And so this background creates this animosity between Catholics slash Christians and Muslims. So that helped also explain why they became victims. Muslims became victims. All right, conversos. The video referred to them as crypto Jews, but another term used at the time were conversos. These were people who converted to Catholicism. And now, why did they do it? Well, many of them had no choice, either convert or lose your job, convert or not be able to have access to banks and money. So basically, many of them converted. And the video said this, right? Like some of them legitimately converted, others continue to practice their faith in secrecy. But that the problem was that they were often accused of it, even if they were legitimately, even if they legitimately converted, they were often accused of being fakers. Scapegoating, not really a specific term for the time period, but one of the big things that winds up coming out of this. The video talked about Jews and Muslims, but another common target were often women or just powerful people in general. The wealthy became easy targets. If someone wanted their land, if someone wanted their property or their wealth or whatever it was, you could accuse them of this stuff, of something, maybe even being a witch or a warlock or whatever, and you could get their stuff for turning them in. So it became very easy for them to basically become targets. Last group is Isabel and Ferdinand. These names might sound familiar. Why? Because they're the ones who will send Christopher Columbus to go and explore, or go the other direction. Sorry. Anyway, the reason they're important is because when the violence breaks out against conversos, all right, and there's mobs in the streets attacking them and hurting them, Isabel and Ferdinand, instead of stepping up and providing protection for these people, actually asked the Catholic Church for permission to begin the Inquisition. So it's a little shocking, I think, that we would expect the government to step up and try to protect people, but instead the government legitimately advocated for attacks on people based off of religious principles and violence. All right, so the next thing we want to talk about is the Council of Trent. So on Canvas, again, you're going to pause me in a second. You're going to find a brief reading that covers the first 3 meetings of the Council of Trent. So what you're going to do is you're going to fill in that chart. The middle column of your chart is basically you. What did they actually decide, do? Why did they do that? Blah, blah, blah. Kind of the big ideas. What reforms, changes, or lack of reforms or changes did they make? And then going back to the top of your sheet, you're going to look at the problems you outline that the Protestants have. Which, if any of those, are being addressed? And how well are they being addressed? So go ahead and pause me and do that. When you're done, answer the summary question on the bottom about this section. So the 3 things you want to know about the Council of Trent, the thing that basically the big takeaway, these are not the reforms. So you didn't do that part, you're not getting yourself any help here. First of all, they reject the Protestant Reformation. They wholly say that they are wrong. And they're basically providing false teachings. And so they're going to stick with what they believe. I mean, the Catholics, that is. Right? They're going to make no major teaching changes to the church teachings or practices. Like I said, Protestants, by and large, believe that if you believe in God and were a good person, you could go to heaven. Catholic Church is like, nope, that's cool and all, but you still need to come to us. You still got to do all those little sacraments, all the little rituals to be saved. Why? Because it keeps the church in power. It keeps them being important. All right. And then lastly, what they really did was they doubled down on what they've already believed. So as a thing, the Council of Trent really didn't bring about massive change. It addressed a couple really big problems, and you'll probably know what that is if you did your stuff. But for the most part, they kind of stayed with being Catholic and didn't embrace a lot of the changes. All right, last little bit here. The effects of the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation broadly in history. First one, I already alluded to it, the spread of Catholicism. Even though the Catholic Church will come under attack and will lose membership by the millions in Europe, what they're going to basically do, led by the Jesuits, is expand the Catholic Church to other parts of the world. At this time in history, it's going to really be Latin America and South America. Later on, when we get into imperialism, it's going to be places like Africa. So those parts of the world have very large Catholic populations today, and this is the reason why. All right. And even though lots of millions and millions of people will leave the church, by and large, Europe stayed pretty Catholic. There are major countries in Europe that are still overwhelmingly Catholic today, but there's also some countries that are, Protestant. So Germany filled lots of Lutherans. England is still a member of the Anglican Church or Church of England, but most of other Europe is either Orthodox or Catholic. And then lastly, the big one we want to get to is the church of the political power of the church begins to fade. It doesn't collapse, begins to fade. People begin to realize the church and power and a government should be separated. So they begin to separate the two. We'll see wars break out across Germany and Italy as people begin to fight over these issues. And so the reality is this, the Reformation may have been the most important event in European history because it greatly affected how Latin America, South America, even the United States, Africa, all developed into new regions when exploration gets started. All right, so guys, I'll see you.